got more to cover here this morning. Accused sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein has been denied bail after a federal judge yesterday rejected his request to await trial under home detention at his Manhattan mansion. Judge Richard Berman said Epstein's, quote, past sexual conduct is not likely to have abated, expressing concern that if Epstein were released, he would be free to abuse teenaged girls. In the bail decision, Judge Berman writes, Mr. Epstein's alleged excessive attraction to sexual conduct with or in the presence of minor girls, which is said to include his soliciting and receiving messages from young girls and young women, perhaps as many as 4 times a day, appears likely to be uncontrollable, and said in court that he doubts any bail package can overcome danger to the community. Epstein's defense team is expected to appeal the ruling, but no bail for Jeffrey Epstein, accused of sex trafficking Dave Ehrenberg, and also already a sexual predator. And the question is, how many others will be revealed as the documents come forward to the public in the coming weeks and months?
I think that you'll see a number of victims come forward now that they can be assured that he will not be released until after the trial, and then I think he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. You know, I think the fact that the Public Corruption Unit of the Southern District of New York, the fact that they're handling this is not random. It's not a coincidence. I think it's because they are looking at some former and current public officials perhaps being involved in the underlying sex trafficking ring or the controversial 2007 non-prosecution agreement. You're also, I would expect to see more indictments of employee 1, 2, and 3 who were listed in the original indictments who enabled Epstein. They're either going to have to testify against him or be indicted themselves. And then as far as Epstein is concerned, I think the best way to add more charges and time to his sentence would be to charge him with possession of child pornography if the feds can prove that some of the images that they recovered from his Manhattan mansion contain images of underage girls. That could set him into prison forever.
And Matt Miller, there's no way the judge could release this man when, even after the 2007 arrest, there was evidence that he continued to make contact with underage girls.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a situation where a defendant was more likely to be denied bail than this, where if you look at his past, he continued after his first arrest to have contact with women, or with girls, I should say. He seemed to be intimidating some of the witnesses at times. He's been recently paying people off after they were contacted by reporters. And then you look at the flight risk he posed. The Southern District of New York FBI agents found in his safe piles of cash, diamonds, and an unexpired passport. Or I'm sorry, a fake passport from another country. I think the only thing that would have been worse would have been evidence that he had a jet, gassed up and waiting on the tarmac to fly him to another country. It was I suspect a pretty open and shut decision for the judge.
You know, Gene Robinson, I have long suspected, based on what I've heard around the set on Morning Joe, when people would tell me stories about this guy Epstein, I've long suspected that he stayed out of trouble for the most part because he had powerful friends on both sides. Powerful Democratic friends, powerful Republican friends. I can't help but think, because of the unit that is now pursuing that we are going to see some big names, big Republican names, big Democratic names, also quite possibly some professors from Harvard get churned up and spit out publicly in what is sure to be a very, very ugly trial.
Yeah, I agree. This is going to be really lurid, but it cannot be an accident that Jeffrey Epstein pursued all these powerful people, as you said, on both sides of the political spectrum in various sorts of elite circles, as kind of a Praetorian guard around him and around his activities, and I suspect that. Especially if there are potential child pornography allegations, which can bring a mandatory sentence of something like 45 years in prison. I suspect there will be a lot of pressure on Epstein to deal and to talk about powerful people whom he enticed into his orbit, and any potential activities they might have been involved in along with him. So this, we haven't even heard the beginning of this. I think this is going to be a big story.
Joe, I would like to challenge reporters out there. You know, we obviously saw that gross tape yesterday of Trump, and we saw obviously Trump talk about how he was friends with him for 15 years, and he liked women, he liked younger women, and Trump's explanation is, oh, I broke off the friendship. Every day now through 2020, there should be specific questions. Have you met him 20 times, 50 times, 100 times? Were you in social situations with him? Don't let Trump off the hook. Every day, ask him about. He has said nothing. He is the president of the United States. He needs to be asked every day, explicitly, did you ever travel with him? Were you at his house? Was he at your house? Do not let up. Do not let that parade pass go by.
Well, I would be very surprised, and Dave Ehrenberg, let me throw this to you really quickly. I'd be very surprised if the President of the United States were able to say no to a deposition in a case like this if you were talking about the possibility of bringing justice to young underage girls who were raped. If the President of the United States has information, which of course he does have information about Jeffrey Epstein, isn't it possible that he could be deposed if for no other reason than to just bring light to the situation and tell prosecutors what he knows?
Indeed, anything is possible in this crazy case. You know, in the James Patterson book, Filthy Rich, a nonfiction book about this, he details how, indeed, that Trump threw Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago after Epstein was hitting on the young daughter of a Mar-a-Lago member. He took that young girl back to his mansion, according to the book, and then asked her to disrobe. The girl told her father, who told Trump, who then kicked Epstein out of the club. So that part does have some corroboration in Trump's story. On the other hand, it is clear, and you saw the video that came out, that Trump and Epstein were pals back in the 90s. They were running buddies. And so I think that a deposition could show something. But I got to say this. I don't think there will end up being a deal with Epstein. Remember the last time that the feds entered into a deal with Epstein? It didn't go so well. It ended in the 2007 non-prosecution agreement. And a guy like Epstein, who's a registered sex offender and accused child molester, they don't make great witnesses on the stand in future cases.
Yeah. Is he at this point, though, being denied bail, a man with nothing left to lose? Because maybe there is information Epstein could provide about powerful men that he provided young girls to. I mean, at this point, does he have any hope of seeing the light of day, Dave Ehrenberg?
You know, I don't think so. And the fact that he's going to be stuck in jail pre-trial is going to embolden a lot of his victims to come forward with their stories, not to mention the possibility of child pornography charges. But, you know, Jeffrey Epstein has every incentive to cut a deal with the prosecutors, but the prosecutors may not want to listen because they're dealing with a guy who is not to be trusted, who is someone who's a pariah in society. And so it's got to be really compelling evidence to sit down and talk with the feds, especially after their last experience of cutting a deal with Epstein.
Well, you know,
Unless
Epstein, Mika, I mean, you have to look at what Epstein's goals at this point may be. He certainly has to know he's never going to get out of prison again for the rest of his life. The question may be for him, how long will his life last inside certain prisons? He faces a pretty tough
fate,
road inside certain prison populations, and so he may cut a deal just to be put to the side somewhere where
I mean, they may not take his word, but he may be able to deliver them evidence that could be helpful.
You know, he had a lot of videotapes. He had a lot of pictures. Yesterday, John Heilman said that there had been talk for quite some time that there's a possibility. It had long been whispered in New York circles that he had photos and videos that and may have made some of his money by blackmailing powerful people with what was inside that safe of his. That it's very interesting. Even when he knew he could be pursued by the feds, he didn't destroy those tapes didn't destroy those videos, maybe there's a reason.
Dave Ehrenberg, Matt Miller, thank you both. Still ahead on Morning Joe, two of the stories we teased at the top of the show. President Trump asks Americans, who are you going to believe, me or your own lying eyes? We fact check his demonstrably false claims straight ahead. Plus, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar goes home, also known as the American Midwest. You're watching Morning Joe. We will be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.